Before we can get into the actual meat of biology, we need to talk about chemistry, because everything that is alive is going to be made up of chemicals, and we'll talk about how that happens and what we are actually made out of. Now, one of the really cool things that most people don't realize is that all of the atoms that you're made up of, and we'll talk about what atoms are, those were created in stars. And so we are made of stardust, as both of these two quotes show. So the atoms of your carbon, your hydrogen, your oxygen, nitrogen, all of those came from a star. So in this class we study biology, but if you break down biological things like living organisms, you're eventually going to end up with chemicals. And today we're going to talk about those different chemicals. Specifically, we're going to talk about elements. And elements are going to be kind of the basic and smallest unit of matter. So matter is going to be something that occupies space and has mass. There is such thing as antimatter out in outer space. We won't get into that because I'm not actually sure what antimatter is, but what we'll be dealing with is matter. So everything that we're made out of will be considered matter. Matter is going to be found in 3 different physical states on the planet. We can have a solid, so think about like an ice cube or a rock. We can have a liquid, which is going to be, think about liquid water, or there's lots of things that can be liquid at certain temperatures, and then gas. So gases can be oxygen, carbon dioxide, lots of different types. So here we have those different states of matter, and each of these has some properties. So for example, solids hold the shape that they're in, and they're a fixed volume. Liquids will just fill the container of whatever they're in. They have a free surface that's not necessarily touching anything, and they have a fixed volume. And a gas is going to kind of take the shape of the container and fill up that volume. Matter is going to be composed of elements, and elements are what can't be broken down. So what we see on this page is the periodic table of elements. So all of these are elements. And on the left side, we actually have kind of over here, this is going to represent the main elements that are going to be part of our actual bodies. There are 92 naturally occurring elements, but only 25 of them are essential for humans and most living things. And so you can see the different percentages on here. We're mostly made out of oxygen, and then we'll have carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. So here's an example of a pure element. This is mercury. Mercury is used in thermometers, and it's very dangerous if ingested. This is pure copper. So copper is going to be found in a lot of electrical devices. It's also, you can find it on parts of cars. And this is pure lead. So if we look at the body and break up what elements our body is composed of, most of our body is going to be made out of oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, and hydrogen. That makes about 96% of the human body. We then have a smaller percentage that is going to be made out of calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. Okay, so that's going to make up most of that. And then we have a very tiny amount of chemicals that we need in a very small amount, and we call these trace elements, but they're absolutely necessary for life. And so these are going to fall into the categories down here, where we have chromium, cobalt, copper, fluorine, iodine, iron, different things like that. For example, iron is going to be essential for our red blood cells to be able to carry oxygen. And if you do not have enough iron, you can become anemic. So it's really important to have that element. We have it in a very small amount, but it is absolutely necessary. Okay, so again, minute amounts, but very crucial. So a little bit more about these trace elements. I want to talk specifically about two. So iodine is really important for the thyroid. When you make thyroid hormones, which are important in your metabolism, iodine is a necessary component. And so if you do not have enough iodine, you can have some issues with your thyroid. This is what pure iodine looks like. You're probably more familiar with iodine that you use for washing cuts. It's kind of that really dark yellowish brown color, and that would be considered iodine as well. You can get iodine from kelp, green vegetables, lots of dairy products, and we actually put it in iodinized salt. So salt naturally does not have iodine on it, but you can actually add it to salt so that when we're eating, we're naturally getting a source of iodine. Another trace element is fluorine. So fluorine is really important for healthy bones and teeth, and it actually has been added to water. Now I couldn't find a picture where it was pure fluorine, but these are 3 different fluorine-containing minerals, so you can actually extract the fluorine from these minerals, and that can be added to the water. So it's going to be in the water so that we can have healthy bones and teeth. If you do not have enough access to fluorine, you will have some issues with your bones and your teeth. If you do not have enough iodine, for example, you can have something called a goiter. And so this is mainly a problem in places where they don't have access to iodinized salt or kind of vegetables and lots of different food types. And so you can get this large part on your neck that actually sticks out. And what's happening is that your thyroid is actually growing in size because it's not making enough thyroid hormone. And so your body thinks it needs to make more, and it makes the thyroid larger, but ultimately this is not going to solve the problem. And so individuals that have these goiters are going to need to be given an iodine supplement. So we're going to talk about the atom, which is the building block of everything. So if we get down to the very smallest unit, we're going to call it an atom. And each element will consist of a specific type of atom. Okay? Atoms are the smallest unit of matter that retain the properties of an element. If you break down an atom, it will no longer have those same properties. And the word atom itself means indivisible in Greek. So this is something that kind of is the smallest unit of matter that we'll start with and kind of build up from there.
So let's look a little closer at atoms. Atoms are going to be composed of what we call subatomic particles. Okay, and so these are smaller than an atom. There are going to be 3 different kinds. We have protons, which are going to be positively charged. We have neutrons, which are neutral, so I'm going to put it 0 because they don't have any charge. And we have electrons, which are going to have a negative charge. Now, protons and neutrons are going to be held in what we call the nucleus. And so I'm going to draw just a general structure of what an atom looks like. So we're going to have a very center part, which is going to be called the nucleus. So that's the nucleus. And there's going to be an outer part, which is going to be called an electron shell. And there actually can be many electron shells. Okay, so I can even draw more of those. So those are electron shells. So protons and neutrons are going to be found in the nucleus. And electrons are going to be found on these outer shells. Okay? And it turns out that the number of electrons that can be on those outer shells is going to be different, and I will talk about how many can be on each shell. Now, I want you to look at kind of protons and electrons. So protons are positive, electrons are negative. And in these situations, these are going to be attracted to each other. So opposite charges okay, so positive and negative are attracted to each other. So the reason why electrons can be in these outer shells, and I want you to know that these shells are not a physical structure. It is an energy level. This is kind of gets beyond the scope of this class, but they are out in that outer layer. And the reason why they don't just fly off into space is because they have this attraction. So the positive is going to be attracted to the negative of the electron. Okay, so we have this kind of interaction between the two right here, which holds the electrons in this outer electron shell. Now, electrons actually move around the nucleus at all times. So it's moving around, and we call this an orbit. So if we have our nucleus and we have our shells, the electrons are actually constantly moving. So it'll be there, and then it can move there, it can go there, and it's constantly moving. We actually don't know exactly where it is at any one time unless you do very specific types of physics. Now, a little bit more about these shells. So we have the protons and neutrons are always going to be in that nucleus, but the electrons are found in the shells, and it turns out that the shells have a certain number of electrons that can be found in each shell. So that first shell, so this is called shell 1, it can hold 2 electrons. Shell 2 can hold 8 electrons. Okay, so shell 2 can have 8 electrons. The third shell, which I'm kind of going to have a hard time drawing right here, it's kind of too big, it can have, so this is shell 3, I'm not going to really draw them out, it can hold 18 electrons. Okay, and so depending on what atom you have, you're going to be able to fill up those spots in these different shells. Okay, so how do we know how many electrons, neutrons, and protons a specific atom has? So each element is going to have a specific number, and it's going to be what we call the atomic number. For example, our first element is going to be hydrogen. And hydrogen is going to have 1 proton, 1 neutron, and 1 electron. Okay, so if we draw that, we have a proton and a neutron in the nucleus, and then in the first shell, so because we don't need any more shells, we're going to have 1 electron. The next element is helium. Helium is going to have 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 electrons. So this is what that's going to look like. So we can have 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and then in our shell, we're going to have 2 electrons. Okay? The next element I'm going to draw for you is actually not going to be the next one that comes in sequence, because that would be lithium. What I'm going to draw for you now is carbon. So carbon is going to be what life forms are based on. So we have carbon. Carbon is going to have 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. Okay? Instead of drawing all of these, I'm going to put in the nucleus, we're going to have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. So I'm just going to kind of draw it like that. So that's the nucleus. There are 6 of each of those. We then are going to have our first shell, and we have 6 electrons. So let's put those in there. So here's our first shell. There's 1 electron and there's 2 electrons. But we have 4 more electrons. However, that first shell will not hold them, so we have to go to the second shell. In the second shell, we will then add our next 4. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we can count this out. So we have, there's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6. So that is our 6 electrons. Now, if you remember me saying in the previous couple slides, there are actually space for 8 electrons in this second shell. So you're going to see that there are 4 empty spaces. So this has 4 empty spaces. And it turns out that elements do not want to have empty spaces on their shells. So their preference is to have a full shell of 8. So what this is going to mean is that if you have an element that has empty shells, it's going to want to interact with other elements so that it can fill in those shells. If we go back to the hydrogen, I forgot to write this here, it only has 1 electron, and so it's going to it has an empty spot. Helium is completely full. And so whatever number of electrons you have on that outer shell is going to determine how it interacts with other atoms. So let me just write that out. So electrons determine how an atom behaves when it encounters other atoms. Okay, so for example, if we have 2 heliums, so we have helium has its proton and neutron, and let's draw 2 heliums. So here's another one, and then they're going to have their electron shells, and they're each going to have 1 electron in their electron shell. Okay, but they have these empty, actually let me draw that. Oh, empty. They have empty electron spots. And so what can happen is that they can share electrons with each other. So I have to draw this slightly differently. Okay, so the protons and neutrons do not react with other atoms. So they are going to be in the center. They do not participate in any type of interaction with other atoms. But what's going to happen is that these hydrogen atoms are going to actually will bind to each other, and they're now sharing these 2 electrons. And so technically they both have 2 electrons in their outer shell, which is going to make them nice and stable. Something like carbon, so carbon, let's draw carbon again. So we have 6p, 6n, okay, first shell, second shell. Let's fill in our electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and then we have 4 empty spots that could be filled. Well, it turns out that carbons can actually bind to 4 other things. And so if we have some hydrogens, so let's say we have a hydrogen right here. So this is going to be 1n and 1p. Okay. And it has an electron. It can share its electron with carbon. And so carbon and hydrogen are actually sharing them. And so it actually can bind with 4 different hydrogens. Okay, so I'm going to just draw it like this. So there could be a hydrogen that's here, a hydrogen here, and a hydrogen here. So carbon is going to be able to make these different connections with these different elements so that it can fill its outer shells.
So I wanted to show you this image of what the atom looks like. This specifically is going to be helium, just so you can appreciate what the cloud looks like. So remember I told you that the electrons are constantly moving and they're circulating around the nucleus, and we often will just show it where you can see the electrons just kind of stable in one spot, but they are constantly moving, and they're not just going in a circle like this, they're moving in all different directions around this nucleus. They stay in an orbit, but they're going around the nucleus. Each element is going to differ in the number of subatomic particles in their atoms, and the number of protons is going to be the atomic number, which is going to tell us what element we have. So for example, oxygen is going to be element number 8 because it's going to have 8 protons. It also has 8 electrons and 8 neutrons. For sodium, it's going to be atomic number 11, so it's the 11th element, and it's going to have 11 protons. Now, all atoms of an element are going to have the same number of protons, regardless of where you find it or kind of what type it is. But there are going to be times where you actually will have a different number of neutrons, okay? And so this situation is what we call an isotope. So isotopes will have the same number of protons. So when we talk about a hydrogen isotope, it's going to have 1 proton. Okay, so here's 1 proton, here's 1 proton, here's another 1 proton. So these are all hydrogen if we look at the proton number. But what you're going to notice is that they have a different number of neutrons. So this one has 1, this has 0, and this one has 2. Now what happens is when you have kind of a different number of neutrons and it's not balanced, so we would say this one right here is balanced because it has 1 of each. When you have either more or less, it can make the elements or the atom kind of unbalanced. And that will have it behave in a different way than your normal stereotypical atom. So many atoms will have different types of these isotopes. And so we looked before in the previous slide at hydrogen. And hydrogen, when it has kind of what we call the situation where it's got 0 neutrons, 1 proton, and 1 electron, that's technically what we would call hydrogen. You won't need to worry about that. When we think of hydrogen, we're really just concerned with how many electrons it has. When it has 1 neutron, 1 proton, and 1 electron, we call that deuterium. And when it has 2 neutrons, and in that situation, it's called tritium. We can also have kind of these different forms of oxygen. So we can have oxygen that has 8 protons and 8 neutrons, which is kind of our standard form. But we can also have a situation where there's 2 extra neutrons, and we would actually call this oxygen 18 isotope. Now, isotopes can come in 2 forms. They can either be stable, which means that having an extra neutron or not as many neutrons is stable and it's not causing too many issues, and so it can hold together the entire atom. But there are other situations where we have an unstable isotope, which means that the nucleus is unstable, and what turns out happening is that the nucleus will start to send out these little particles, and we call this radioactive isotopes or radioactive decay. So the nucleus will actually decay spontaneously, sending out particles from the nucleus. So here we have carbon, and our normal situation for carbon is going to be 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. That's kind of standard, that's stable. And then we have carbon-13, which is going to have 1 additional neutron, and that also is stable. But when we have carbon-14, we are going to have 2 additional neutrons, and that makes this radioactive. And so what happens with carbon-14 is that it will decay at a very kind of regular rate, and we actually use carbon-14 to date different materials to see how old things are. Okay, so when you have this radioactive atom, it will send off these particles, and when it sends off the particle, it actually releases a little bit of energy, and that energy is called radiation. Okay? So the energy can be destructive and actually can damage your own cells, so it's important to kind of know when you're around radioactive isotopes. Okay? They are used in research a lot and also medicine. So there are situations where you want to use the radioactive radiation to try to damage cancer cells. So that's one example. So here we have prostate cancer that's treated with radiation. So what they do in this situation is that they take these little radioactive seeds. So these little tiny, look like metal seeds, are going to be placed inside of the prostate, which is right here. Men are the only groups that have prostates. Females do not have prostates. So the prostate is going to be this kind of gland that's going to sit around what turns into the urethra. So we have the bladder up here. There is going to be urine that flows down through here and out through the penis of the urethra. Okay, so prostates are one of organ that tend to get cancer in older men, and if you implant these little radioactive seeds inside of the prostate, it will actually send off that radiation and start to kill the cancer cells. And so if you look at the data right here, it's showing you that kind of having the seeds and surgery and the radiation are actually, in the first 5 years all fairly similar. But in the long run, these seeds that have the radiation are actually very effective with treating prostate cancer. Now, another really cool thing about the radioactive carbon is that our bodies will take up, anything that's living will take up carbon-14 because it's just present in the environment, in the atmosphere. So when it is kind of present in the atmosphere, the carbon-14 will be oxidized and can form into carbon dioxide, and that can be incorporated into plants, and then we can eat it. Okay, so if we consume carbon-14 or another animal consumes carbon-14, it is stuck in our bones and it just is there. And when an animal dies, so for example this woolly mammoth right here, when it dies, it will stop incorporating carbon-14 because there's no metabolism going on. And what happens is that because carbon-14 is radioactive, it'll decay at a very specific rate, and we know what that rate is. So you can measure the amount of carbon-14 that's left within a skeleton and kind of determine how old something is and kind of when did it die, basically. Okay, so here is just another image of what this would look like, and you have carbon-14 to start with, so 6 protons, 8 neutrons. It's unstable. We can have some decay take place, and in the case of carbon-14, it actually turns into nitrogen-14 when it starts to decay. So you can kind of measure the amount of carbon-14 and nitrogen-14 and see what is your proportion of each one, and that will give you an idea of how old something is. Here is half-lives. So we know and we have measured the half-lives of different radioactive elements, and you start off kind of at the beginning with 100% radioactivity, and then after half of the time, the half-life, you will have depleted half of the amount of the radioactive isotopes, and then another additional half-time, and you would have a quarter of the amount. And so they can actually measure this and find out how old things are. Now, you probably have heard of the Chernobyl accident. There are TV shows that are on these days. And this is a nuclear waste accident where a nuclear power plant actually had a major disaster, and lots of radioactive materials were kind of sent out from that disaster, and you can actually see that took place in Chernobyl, which is in the Ukraine, but all of the Western Europe and some even of kind of the Middle East are going to have a portion of the cesium, which is one of those radioactive materials. Okay, and so kind of the radioactive material got onto the wind and was transferred all over this area. So moving on from isotopes, we're now going to talk about kind of what happens when you start to join different elements together. So when we join atoms together, they are going to form things called molecules and compounds. So a molecule is going to be when you have two or more atoms bonded together. They can be kind of the same actual atom, so you can have two hydrogens, two oxygens, and so forth. A compound is when you have two or more molecules of different kinds. So generally, when we're going to talk about proteins and other things in the body, those are all going to be considered compounds because they're not made out of just one type of element. For example, C6H12O6, which is glucose, is going to be what we would call a compound. Okay? Molecules that only have one type, so H2 or O2, is going to be what we would consider a molecule. When atoms of different elements bind to each other, we consider these energy relationships because the electrons that are going to be the main players in all of these chemical bonds are going to be able to store energy in these relationships, these chemical bonds, and we'll talk about some important ones. Okay, chemical bonds are not physical structures. It's kind of hard to visualize this because electrons are constantly circling around and orbiting around the nucleus, and so they kind of will inhabit areas and cause a chemical bond, but it's not an actual physical structure. That's not really too important for this class to understand that, and it is kind of complicated. But it is important just to remember that within chemical bonds, there is energy. Okay? Electrons are going to be the subatomic particles that are going to be involved in chemical reactions. So the protons and the neutrons inside of the nucleus are not going to be involved in those. Okay? Only the electrons, which are going to be on the outer edges of the atom, are going to be involved in any type of chemical reaction. Okay? So these shells that all of these different atoms have, they are going to fill up in a very specific way. So you always are going to fill the first shell, max number is 2, then you go to the second shell, and that max number is going to be 8 in that shell. You can go to third shell, fourth shell, much higher. We're not really going to talk about anything higher than the third shell. But when there are spaces that are not filled, that's when we're going to start having these chemical bonds. Okay, so this just shows the different numbers of electrons. So shell 3 can hold 18 electrons in it. None of the different sodium, chlorine, or argon have actually all of those 18, but they can technically hold that many. Okay, when we look at a electron or a atom, we want to look at its outer ring, because the outer ring is going to be what we call the valence shell, and this is what's going to let us know if this can form chemical bonds or not. Okay, so if there are electrons in that outer valence shell, those ones are going to have the highest potential energy. Okay, so when they bind to things, they'll have kind of energy that's going to be able to stored within that bond. Okay. So there are 3 types of chemical bonds that we're going to talk about in this class. We have ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. The first type of chemical bond we're going to talk about are ionic bonds. And first, let's talk about ions. Ions are going to be atoms that have gained or lost an electron. And when that happens, they become charged. So they either have a positive or a negative charge. Now, the reason why they have a charge is because if you gain something that's negative or you give away something that's negative, that's going to affect your charge. Electrons are negative, so let's think about this. If you have something that's negative and you get more of them, so you get an extra electron, you're going to become more negative, which would be an ion, so a negative ion. If you, however, give away an electron, so you're giving away something that's negative, that actually makes you a little bit more positive, and so that is called a positive ion. Now, the way that these ions are formed are through the transfer of the actual electrons. So when you transfer an electron from one atom to another, it creates those ions. And nothing's happening to the protons. So in this situation, what's happening is that the protons are staying the same, but the electrons are changing. So that's going to be why it changes it into what we call an ion. Okay. Because there's a kind of transfer of electrons and we start to have this kind of negative and positive, so here you have the positive, in this case sodium, and a negative chlorine or chloride, they're going to be attracted to each other because positive and negatives, opposites attract. Okay, so in this one we have sodium that has kind of 8 in its outer shell, so it would be nice and stable if it had that, but unfortunately it has this one little extra electron right here. And we have chlorine that is going to have one empty spot that is preventing it from having 8 in this outer shell. And so what happens is sodium will donate its electron to chlorine. Chlorine will now be nice and full, and the sodium will be full as well. And they will have that positive and negative, and they will associate with each other, creating something called sodium chloride, which is table salt. Okay, and so they stick together because of this positive and negative. So here is just shown that kind of with an image. So we have our sodium with that one extra little electron, and we have a hole in the chlorine, and what happens is we donate the electron from the sodium, it fills in that spot, and now we have that attraction between these two. Here's another example. So we have lithium and fluoride. So lithium has actually 3 electrons, but it's going to donate 1 to fluoride. And so this creates something called lithium fluoride. And when you have these situations, when these ions are going to form, they're considered salts. So the way to remember that is sodium chloride, which is table salt. And so this is lithium fluoride, which is another type of salt, not one that you would eat. The next type of bond is called a covalent bond. And a covalent bond is when 2 atoms will share, so keyword share, 1 or more pairs of electrons. Okay, this is the strongest bond that we'll talk about. And these are the bonds that create the molecules that we are made out of. So when we look at your body, we could break it down into your different chemical and molecules. You're made out of molecules that have a lot of covalent bonds. Okay. The most common covalent bond is going to be between hydrogen and carbon. So we'll see a lot of different molecules, and specifically macromolecules that have just tons of carbons and hydrogens bound to each other. Okay, the number of covalent bonds that an atom can form is going to be equal to the number of empty spots in its outer shell. So for example, carbon is going to have 4 empty spots, so it can form 4 covalent bonds. Hydrogen has 1 empty spot, it's going to be able to form 1 covalent bond. So here we have H2O, so we have water, and our hydrogen is going to be sharing the electrons with oxygen. So we have 2 hydrogens. So the hydrogen is making 1 covalent bond. This hydrogen is making 1 covalent bond. And oxygen, it has 2 empty spots. So it's actually going to have 2 covalent bonds. So this is going to then be a water molecule with these covalent bonds. Now there are 2 types of covalent bonds. There's one called a nonpolar covalent bond. In a nonpolar covalent bond, the electrons are going to be shared equally between the 2 atoms. Okay, so each of the atoms is going to hold onto that electron with the same amount of strength. So for example, one nonpolar molecule that we'll talk about a lot is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide has 1 carbon and 2 oxygens, and they're going to evenly share those bonds. The second type is called a polar covalent bond, and polar covalent bonds involve an unequal sharing of the electrons between 2 atoms. In this situation, you have one atom that is bigger and stronger and is going to pull harder on that electron, and it pulls it towards itself, which makes it slightly negative. Okay, because again, if you have something that's pulling on an electron or pulling a negative towards its body, it's going to become slightly negative. Okay, this results in a electrically polar molecule, and what that means is that one of the sides is going to have a slight positive charge and one of the sides is going to have a slight negative charge. So here we have a water molecule. So this is oxygen and 2 hydrogens, and the oxygen is really pulling on that electron from those 2 hydrogens. The hydrogens are really small. I always like to use the example of an adult playing tug-of-war with 2 little kids. Each kid is on a different rope, and the adult is being able to pull on the rope much harder than the little kids because they're bigger and they're stronger. Okay, this is what's happening in a polar covalent molecule. So it's causing that there is a slight negative charge because the oxygen is pulling the electron towards its body, and the hydrogens are having kind of an electron pulled away from themselves, which makes them slightly positive. So we set up this situation where we do not have an equal sharing, and you actually have some charge associated with this molecule. Okay, so many atoms will have different electron attracting abilities, and this will lead to that unequal sharing. Okay, atoms that have really greater electron attracting ability, like for example oxygen. So oxygen is super reactive and really pulls hard on those electrons. It is going to cause this situation. Okay, and so in this case, what's going to happen is that the oxygen, that red molecule, is going to have an electronegative charge, and the hydrogens are going to have electropositive charge. I wanted to show this image because it shows a little bit more detail about how electrons are being shared. So in this top group, we have 2 hydrogens, and they are sharing those 2 electrons. This is considered a single bond because they're only sharing, each one is donating just 1. So they are kind of only sharing 1 electron with each other, and that is going to be the kind of bond they have. There are other cases where some atoms will actually share 2 pairs of electrons. Okay, and so in this case, both of these electrons are being shared with these oxygen atoms, and a double bond is kind of drawn with 2 lines, looks kind of like an equal sign. That is going to be the double bond. This is what carbon and 4 hydrogens looks like. These are all going to be shared equally, and they're all single bonds, and this is how you would write this out. So you could just put carbon, hydrogen, 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 and this is actually called methane. These other models are just showing the same molecule in just a little bit of a different way. And so you will see all of these different versions throughout this course. So just, they're all the same thing, but they're showing it in kind of a different way. For example, the space filling model is trying to show where the electrons are going to be traveling because it's a bigger area than if you have just kind of something like a ball and stick model. The last type of bond we're going to talk about are hydrogen bonds. And hydrogen bonds result because of polar covalent bonds. So I had the same image that we've seen before. And so this is a water molecule. And the water molecule, because there's unequal sharing of the electrons, the hydrogens are going to have this slight positive charge. And when we talk about hydrogen bonds, it's what we're talking about, this right here. So that slight positive charge is going to allow for those hydrogens to then bind with something else or have this kind of small amounts of electrostatic attraction to other things that are negative. Water is going to be the molecule that we mostly talk about with hydrogen bonds. There are definitely other ones, but here is a different kind of image of the water molecule where you can see that these yellow lines, arrows, are actually representing the electron being pulled away from the hydrogens and causing that slightly positive charge. Okay, this causes the entire molecule to be polar because it has a positive side and it has a negative side. Okay, now that we have this set up, we can see how other water molecules will actually interact with each other. So when you have a bunch of water, you're going to have these polar sides. So you're going to have a side that's slightly negative and a side that's slightly positive. And what happens is that the slightly positive side of the hydrogen is going to interact with the slightly negative side of the oxygen, causing a hydrogen bond. Okay, and this is really important because water has a lot of special properties that are caused because of this hydrogen bond. Okay, and so again, the reason why this is happening is because there is a polar molecule that has a slightly positive side, a slightly negative side, and it can interact with another water molecule that has a slightly positive side and a slightly negative side. And so they start to arrange themselves in this order. Before I talk about the special properties of water, I just want to mention the idea of these chemical reactions. And so cells are constantly going to rearrange molecules in our body. They're going to break bonds and form new ones. And when we do things like this, it's called a chemical reaction. And in a chemical reaction, you're not creating or destroying matter, so the number of atoms are always going to stay the same, but you can rearrange what things are bound to. For example, if you have something like 2 H2 hydrogen gas molecules and you have some oxygen gas, you can then make water. So these plus this will equal water. Okay. In this situation, we call the parts before the chemical reaction take place the reactants. So they're going to be what react and cause the chemical reaction. And the final part are going to be called the products. So now we're going to talk about water and all of its special properties because it's going to be essential for life. We would not be here, any life form on the planet would not be here without water and its special properties. So we go far enough back and we will talk about kind of life on Earth beginning. The reason why life was able to begin was because of water. And water is where life evolved more than 3 billion years ago, and every life form starts kind of in the water, and then we slowly have a transition onto land. But water is the place where the first life forms existed. Cells are composed almost entirely, in some cases, of water, so 95%. Most of them are going to be somewhere in between 70 and 95%. Water makes the Earth habitable, and one of the first things that we look at when we're on other planets or exploring out in outer space is looking for evidence of water, because we know that water was essential for the beginning of life on our planet. And if there's water other places, it's possible that there could be life forms there as well. Now we're going to go over the different properties that allow water to be life-sustaining or life-supporting. Water is a very important and extraordinary molecule, and it all has to do with that polarity and those hydrogen bonds. So the fact that there is a slight positive and negative charge on the water molecule, that is going to give it 4 life-supporting properties. So the following are going to be water's life-supporting properties. So water molecules stick together. Water is going to have a strong resistance to change in temperature. Frozen water floats, and water is a common solvent for life. So the first is this stickiness, or more scientifically we would call it the cohesion of water. So water molecules stick together because of those hydrogen bonds that are forming. Unfortunately, this cartoon doesn't really show that correctly, because unfortunately it's showing, well, water to water molecule in the way that it's showing that the oxygens are holding hands. But what's really happening is that the slightly positive hydrogen is going to attract to the slightly negative oxygen, which would cause the actual water molecules to stick together. Okay, this is called cohesion and is really important in a lot of different life forms and how water can move through plants, for example. Okay, so when plants are going to transport their water, water will pull on other water molecules and move water from one place to another. So for example, this is the tallest tree in the world. This is called Hyperion, and it's 379 feet. This is actually in California. No one knows the exact location because they want to keep it secret, but this tree is absolutely massive. But if you think about the tree, how does water from the roots that are 379.7 feet below get to the very tippy top of those leaves? Well, it all has to do with cohesion. So water molecules that come in through the roots will pull on other water molecules that will kind of transport the water through these specialized tubes and get water all the way up to the leaves. Okay, and so this is what that looks like. This is the flow of water. Part of the way that this happens is that you have evaporation from leaves, and so as water molecules leave the leaf, the water will pull on other water molecules below it. Okay, and so you can see the cohesion due to those hydrogen bonds. Another thing that happens with cohesion of water is that there's this high surface tension. And surface tension is going to be a measure of how difficult it is to stretch kind of those hydrogen bonds away from each other. Okay? Water has a high surface tension because of those hydrogen bonds, which allows certain insects that are really small to be able to balance and kind of sit on top of the water. If anything is too big, for example, you would not be able to walk on water because you're just too heavy and you'll kind of push through that surface tension. But if you're very light, you will actually be able to float on the surface. So here's a picture of the spider up close, and you can kind of see there's a dent in the water where the feet are touching, and that is due to the surface tension and those hydrogen bonds that are holding water molecules together. Water will also be able to moderate temperature. The hydrogen bonds between water molecules absorb the heat when they break and release heat when they form. This minimizes temperature changes. Water helps maintain a moderate temperature of organisms and environments. Water takes a long time to heat up and holds its temperature longer when heat is not applied. Now, the water on the Earth will help moderate temperatures, keeping it within the limits that permit life. If there wasn't water, the environment would get too hot or too cold, which would cause issues for us. Okay, so during summer, the water of Earth stores huge amounts of heat from the sun, and during the winter, the water will give off that heat. Water will also help with evaporative cooling in our bodies. So when you have evaporative cooling, or like we like to call it, sweating, you are having water that's being released from your body, and through that process, you are getting rid of heat. So it cools the body, it prevents overheating, and we sweat, but other animals that aren't able to sweat will do things like panting. Here's a good example of evaporative cooling. So this football player who looks like he's on the Denver Broncos, and if it's Denver and it's middle of winter, it can be very cool, but he is really hot from playing football, and so you can actually see the steam or the water evaporating from his head. Okay, breaking the bonds of the hydrogen will release heat energy, making the heat leave the body. Another really important property of water is that it floats when it is a solid, which we call ice. So ice is going to float. This is really important because lots of life live in the water today, and all of life lived in the water at some point in the past. And so if water froze and sank, it would make sure that the oceans would freeze completely, all the rivers and lakes would freeze completely, and all life would die if that took place. Okay? Floating ice actually acts as an insulator and keeps the liquid water under it kind of warmer than it would be without that ice. Now, why does ice float? Now, when water molecules become cold enough, they will kind of form this, I like to call it arms apart formation, where they have their hydrogen ions that are kind of spread out, and the way that they arrange themselves in space are going to be spread out compared to when it's liquid form. So when we look at ice, it's going to have fewer water molecules than the same volume of liquid because the water molecules spread out when they get cold. Okay? Ice floats because it is less dense than the liquid around it. So here's an image of what the water molecules look like when they freeze. And so this is what I was trying to say, like arms apart, where they're kind of they're very far apart from each other and kind of creating this grid. And if you have ever done this before, put a full water bottle in the freezer, it often will break the plastic water bottle and explode out of it because as water freezes, it expands. Most liquids of other types, so we're not talking about water, their molecules tend to get closer together as they get colder, which is the opposite of what happens with water. Okay, so again, this arm's length apart, there are fewer water molecules in the same kind of volume, and this all causes the water to float in the form of ice. The last major property of water is that it acts as a solvent of life. And the solvent is basically what everything is dissolved in. So water can dissolve lots of different things. We use water to dissolve things like Jello, or I guess Jello is the only one I can really think about right now, or coffee. You know, it's going to be able to dissolve a lot of different things inside of it. And that's going to be really important because in our bodies, that is what all of the different solutes, which are kind of the other molecules, they're going to be dissolved in. Water is going to be the medium where all of our chemical reactions are going to take place. So it's going to be really important to maintain the right amount of water in our bodies because we need that for our chemical reactions to take place. So a solution is going to be a liquid that has two or more substances. And when we talk about the dissolving agent, which is usually going to be water in all of our cases, that is called the solvent. And then whatever is dissolved in the solvent is going to be called the solute. We will be talking about these in lab quite a bit because we're going to talk about kind of how things dissolve and how things move in the body and also in plants and other cells like that. Okay, so when water is a solvent, then we have something called an aqueous solution. Here are a couple examples of solvents that we have. So water is going to be the main component of blood, sap, and the extracellular fluid in our bodies. So that's going to complete this lecture. I want to really just put this out there that if you are getting confused and having a hard time following along, please reach out to me because I am here to help you. I want you to succeed, but I need to know if you're having an issue. So please email me and we can set up a meeting where we can talk about this information and go over it. And I can try to help you with some different ways to learn the material. Thanks.